August 3rd, 1969. I remember the date because it was the first night I realized sleep could be used as a weapon. Our fire support base sat on a low rise southwest of Quang Tri, high enough to observe the valley, but low enough to remain vulnerable to indirect fire. We were a reinforced infantry company, 121 men on the roster that week, organized into 3 rifle platoons, supported by 2 M60 machine guns, an 81 mm mortar section inside the wire, and artillery on call from a rear base several kilometers away. By doctrine, everything was in order. Night defensive posture went into effect at 2200 hours. Sentries rotated, lights were out, voices dropped to whispers. The younger soldiers tried to grab short stretches of sleep, knowing full well that uninterrupted rest was rare in this part of Vietnam. At 2247 hours, just as I finished unlacing my boots inside the command bunker, the first round landed. It wasn't accurate. It didn't hit the command post, the mortar pit, or the artillery position. It detonated near the northern perimeter in open ground filled with elephant grass and churned red soil. Minimal damage, no casualties, but the timing was exact. 3 minutes later, a second round fell. 11 minutes after that, a third. There was no pattern that fit conventional artillery doctrine, no preparatory fire, no saturation, no attempt to walk rounds onto a target. Each shell arrived just as the body began to relax, just as breathing slowed and the mind edged towards sleep. I checked my luminous watch in the dark. The intervals were irregular, but the intent was unmistakable. This wasn't harassment in the casual sense. This was calculated. They weren't trying to destroy the base. They were attacking our circadian rhythm. This was classic harassing fire, executed with discipline. Likely 1 or 2 light tubes, possibly mortars or small caliber artillery, firing single rounds from multiple positions. Fire once, displace, wait. Never stay long enough to give us a clean grid for counter battery fire. The objective wasn't structural damage. It was exhaustion. Platoon 2 requested permission to fire mortars in response. I denied it. That decision wasn't hesitation. It was restraint. Returning fire blindly would have accomplished exactly what the enemy wanted. We would burn ammunition, reveal our firing positions, and tire our crews, all while shooting at ghosts. By morning, they would still be alert, and we would be depleted. Instead, I ordered radio silence, limited movement, and no use of white light. Those were rational orders. Human nerves, however, don't always obey reason. Every distant explosion caused shoulders to tense and fingers to tighten around rifle grips. The men weren't afraid of dying. They were afraid of not knowing when to rest. The second night, August 4th, the first round landed at 23:05 hours. Nobody was asleep yet. A single shell, then nothing for nearly 20 minutes. Then another, farther away. The randomness was deliberate. The timing was not. Every round arrived just before true rest could begin. I began logging everything: times, directions, distances, sound delay. After 2 nights, a pattern emerged. At least 2 firing locations, a spotter somewhere with a clear view of the base, someone who understood not just terrain, but human behavior, how American soldiers slept, how long it took for tension to fade. This wasn't a large artillery unit. It was a small, patient element that understood psychology as well as ballistics. By August 6, we had suffered no serious casualties, no bunkers destroyed, no weapons lost. But the damage was visible. Reaction times slowed, tempers shortened, hands shook slightly during sentry duty. Sleep deprivation was doing what explosives could not, eroding discipline from the inside. Harassing fire doesn't announce itself as an attack. It disguises itself as inconvenience. But given enough nights, inconvenience becomes impairment. And standing there at dawn on August 6th, watching men move like they hadn't quite finished waking up, I understood something unsettling. The most dangerous round hadn't landed yet. August 7th, 1969. By the fourth night, it was no longer a question of whether the harassing fire would come. The only uncertainty was when. We adjusted our posture the way doctrine suggested: shortened guard shifts, enforced rest periods, rotating platoons through the quieter sectors of the perimeter. On paper, it looked sound. In practice, the enemy was already ahead of us. Every adjustment we made assumed that sleep could still be scheduled. It couldn't. The first round that night came earlier, just after 2200 hours. Too early to be effective tactically, but effective psychologically. It forced men back into bunkers before they had mentally transitioned out of the day. The second round didn't arrive until near midnight. By then, everyone was lying still, afraid to relax, afraid to commit to rest they knew would be interrupted. I watched it happen in real time. Soldiers stopped trying to sleep altogether. They lay awake, listening, counting seconds between imagined sounds. That was worse than being woken up. Fatigue from interrupted sleep is damaging. Fatigue from no sleep at all is crippling. We considered countermeasures, aggressive patrols beyond the wire, radar queuing, preemptive fire missions. Each option carried risk. Patrols at night against an unseen mobile mortar team invited ambush. Counter battery fire required precise data we didn't have. Preemptive fire wasted ammunition and signaled desperation. The enemy was forcing us to choose between bad options. By August 9th, the effects were undeniable. Junior leaders made small mistakes, missed radio calls, incorrect counts during stand to, hesitation during routine movements. Nothing catastrophic, not yet. But war doesn't require catastrophic errors. It feeds on small ones, accumulated over time. The enemy understood that. They never fired 2 nights the same way. One night it was 3 rounds, another night it was 1. Sometimes nothing until dawn, just to remind us that anticipation itself was exhausting. They dictated the rhythm. We reacted. On August 10th, I gathered the platoon sergeants and told them the truth as plainly as I could. We were no longer fighting for ground. We were fighting for function. Our goal wasn't to stop the fire, it was to prevent it from hollowing us out. We stopped chasing sleep. Instead, we broke it apart. 20 minutes here, 15 there. Men slept in shifts that made no sense on a clock, but made sense to the nervous system. Some slept during daylight under watch, others rested during lulls we couldn't predict but learned to recognize. It didn't stop the rounds, nothing did. But slowly, the enemy's advantage narrowed. They could still wake us, but they couldn't fully control us anymore. By mid-August, the harassing fire tapered off. Not because we had defeated it, but because it had served its purpose. The message had been delivered and understood. In this war, firepower wasn't always about destruction. Sometimes it was about denying something far more basic: rest. August 14th, 1969. When the fire stopped, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like suspicion. 3 nights passed without a single round, no distant thump, no delayed echo rolling across the valley. The men noticed immediately. Silence, after so much disruption, felt unnatural, like a held breath that never released. That was the final phase of it. I understood that now. Harassing fire doesn't end with noise. It ends with doubt. Every sentry scanned harder. Every bunkmate lay awake longer, waiting for a round that never came. The enemy no longer needed to fire. They had trained us to expect it. Anticipation did the rest of the work for them. By then, the company had adapted. Sleep was fragmented by design. We no longer tried to protect the night. We treated the entire 24-hour cycle as contested space. Decision-making slowed, but it stabilized. The men learned how to function while tired, how to recognize when fatigue was lying to them. Still, something had been permanently altered. On August 16th, Battalion requested a report on enemy activity. I listed the obvious facts: estimated tube count, firing intervals, lack of identifiable firing positions. But what I couldn't fully convey was the cost that never appeared on paper. There was no column for eroded confidence, no checkbox for chronic alertness. The enemy had never tried to defeat us in the conventional sense. They never attempted to overrun the base or silence our guns. They targeted something more vulnerable: predictability, routine, the assumption that nights at least belonged to us. By late August, operations resumed at a normal tempo. Patrols pushed out, fire missions were answered. On the surface, we looked the same as we had before August 3rd. We weren't. Every man in that company had learned a lesson that couldn't be unlearned. That control didn't come from holding ground or dominating terrain. It came from shaping how the other side lived, slept, and thought. The rounds that landed during those nights caused little physical damage, but they proved something far more dangerous. In Vietnam, the enemy didn't need to beat us in a single decisive moment. They just needed to make sure the war followed us into our sleep. August 21st, 1969. By the 3rd week, the absence of fire had become its own kind of pressure. Men stopped asking if it would start again and began asking when. That uncertainty lingered in every routine task: cleaning weapons, checking wire, filling sandbags. Nothing felt purely administrative anymore. Everything carried the expectation of interruption. From a command perspective, this was the lasting effect of the campaign against us. Harassing fire had ended, but its influence remained embedded in our behavior. The enemy had succeeded in reshaping how we allocated attention. Even during daylight, a sudden distant sound could pull heads toward the horizon. Not fear, conditioning. I reviewed our logs from early August and saw the progression clearly. The first nights produced tension, the middle phase produced fatigue, the final phase produced adaptation. That was the part that concerned me most. Adaptation cuts both ways. It keeps you alive, but it also normalizes stress that shouldn't be normal. On August 23rd, we received replacements, new men flown in from rear areas. They arrived rested, alert, still carrying the assumption that nightfall meant relative safety. It lasted less than a day. They noticed how the veterans slept in fragments, how rifles were never more than an arm's reach away, how nobody fully relaxed even during quiet hours. Experience transferred faster than any briefing. We never identified the exact unit responsible for the harassment. No confirmed firing position, no captured observers, no decisive engagement to close the account. In another kind of war, that might have been considered a failure. Here, it was expected. The enemy didn't measure success by what they destroyed, but by what they altered. By the end of August, higher command shifted focus to other sectors. Our base faded back into the background of the operational map. On paper, we were stable, effective, mission capable, but I knew better. Those nights had taught us that superiority in firepower didn't guarantee control over time, that even a small, disciplined force could impose its will by choosing when to act rather than how hard to strike. Years later, what stayed with me wasn't the sound of the explosions. It was the waiting between them, the way silence became suspect, the way rest felt earned, temporary, and fragile. The shells had stopped falling, but the lesson they carried stayed with us long after the jungle went quiet. September 2nd, 1969. By the time the monsoon clouds thickened and the nights grew heavier, the lesson had settled in fully. The harassing fire campaign was no longer an event we discussed. It was a condition we operated under, like humidity or mud. Invisible, constant, shaping everything. What struck me most, looking back through the logs, was how little ammunition the enemy had needed. A handful of rounds each night, fired with patience, timed with understanding. Against that, we had committed far more resources, man-hours, attention, emotional energy, than any conventional attack would have required. It was an asymmetry that no fire mission could correct. We adjusted training accordingly. I stopped briefing night security as a phase and started briefing it as a mindset. There was no longer a clean boundary between rest and readiness. Men learned to recognize their own limits, to call out when fatigue was affecting judgment. That alone probably prevented accidents and friendly fire incidents later in the month. Still, the cost was real. Fatigue doesn't announce itself dramatically. It seeps in. It shows up as hesitation at the wrong moment or impatience at the wrong one. Command decisions took longer. Simple problems felt heavier than they should have. None of it rose to the level of failure, but war rarely needs failure. It only needs erosion. By mid-September, intelligence suggested the enemy unit had moved on. Another base, another valley, another set of men who still believed that nighttime meant a pause in the war. I found myself wondering if they would recognize the pattern as quickly as we eventually had, or if they would have to learn it the same way. On September 18th, I wrote my final entry on the subject, not because it was resolved, but because there was nothing more to add. The campaign hadn't been about shells or craters or casualties. It had been about control, of rhythm, of expectation, of the thin line between alertness and exhaustion. The enemy had never tried to overwhelm us. They had simply refused to let us rest on our own terms. That, more than anything else, defined the kind of war we were fighting. Not one where victory came from a single decisive blow, but one where survival depended on enduring pressure that never quite became a battle and never quite went away. The guns eventually fell silent. The nights never did.